Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Hyrule, and today's video is going to be kind of a retrospective of the last 10 days of Suicide Squad, because I think at this point now, 10 days in, we kind of have an idea of where things are, and then from where things are, I'm going to be talking about where I want them to go, and hopefully this kind of sparks some discussion, because I think now, after 10 days, there's some sources of frustration, but there's also some sources of optimism. And I think it's good to kind of put everything together in one little package and kind of just break down my thoughts. So with that being said, let's start with the first topic for today's video. All right, so the first one is going to be the bugs and everything that has gone on from that side of the game. Now, we can't talk about the bugs without talking about the big one, right? Which has been that people haven't been able to play the game since January 30th. There have been people who have logged in and then all of a sudden they can't log in anymore, and there have been people who have just never been able to play the game whatsoever. This has been a source of frustration for a lot of people, and for many of you who may know Doomkiller, this has definitely been a source of frustration because they can't even just play the game like rest of us. And obviously, when you have a game that launches, obviously you want people to play the game, right? So from our perspective as consumers, as players, as community members, that's obviously frustrating. You pay for your product, you can't get your product, right? Essentially, that always is going to be a source of frustration. From Rocksteady's side, they produce a product, they want people to play it, they want people to enjoy it, and then they can't do it, right? But there is some hope there, right? And obviously, for many of you guys who, once again, follow Doomkiller, he was just able to log in yesterday. So obviously, if they're able to figure it out for one person, the hope is that they're able to figure it out for many other people and actually allow them to play the game. Now, it remains to be seen how they did that. It remains to be seen how they're going to do that for everybody else who may be impacted, but there is some hope there that they have figured this thing out. I think when it comes to server issues, there's a few different points that you could talk about, right? Obviously, the big one is going to be always online, right? And I think before the game launched, there was a lot of trepidation about such a system working in a game like this. And then obviously, it's like the worst case scenario for some people who can't even access the game, right? And then obviously, when you look at, the situation that is unfolding, it's just unfortunate that it took this long for at least Doom to be figured out, and then however much longer it takes for the rest of them to be figured out. We still haven't gotten like a major patch yet. And for any of you guys who was in Marvel's Avengers in that community, they actually did do a patch that had like 1,000 fixes or something, and I definitely could see Suicide Squad and Rocksteady putting out a patch like that where it's a bunch of fixes all at once. But the good thing and the bad side about that is that obviously getting all those fixes at once could fix a whole host of issues right there, but obviously you're waiting a little bit longer to make sure they test all those fixes, compile them, then they have to pass certification, so it actually can take a bit longer for those. So we're kind of in this weird waiting period when it comes to a lot of the bugs, including that one, for them to kind of work on it. Now, when it comes to some of the other bugs, for example, like the mastery levels are locked, and that's the one I'm experiencing, so I can't even progress to the end game. That's definitely frustrating, because once you hit that certain point of the game, it's like, I want to do the end game stuff, I want to do the mastery level stuff, and when you can, it's like, what purpose does the game serve at that point? So I think a lot of people like myself are kind of in a position where you're kind of wondering, like, what do you do? Like, do you just play other games until then? And I think that's kind of where a lot of people are at. It's like, if you have to LFG and do random matchmaking for the end game, like, that's okay. But sometimes you just want to see how far you can push it yourself, and when you can't do that, it's unfortunate. A lot of the other bugs definitely are annoying. There's definitely bugs going on when it comes to the enemies and sort of the interaction you have with the enemies. And then the multiplayer servers and how they degrade over time when you're playing with your friends. That's obviously a huge source of frustration for a lot of people. I've seen Lejeune talk about it on Twitter. I've seen some others mention it, right? So this game does have its fair share of bugs, and each with their own priority level that they have to fix. And obviously that definitely is a source of frustration for many, including myself. So while the game has worked fabulously for a lot of people, there is still a lot of people out there that haven't had the greatest of experiences, and obviously you want that to be improved, right? So I'm going to rate this as like a 6 out of 10 in terms of what's gone on. Once again, a lot of people have had great experiences, but I think there's been enough frustration there that people have definitely had not the greatest of launches with this game, and obviously Rocksteady would like to improve that, and I would like to see them kind of talk about that a little bit more, which leads us into our next topic, the communication. So when it comes to communication, that's always going to be an interesting topic to talk about, because a lot of the time community managers are stuck in the middle between like a war going on between the developers and the suits, and them trying to kind of, put out all the fires and try to make sure that the strategy is aligned with what they want to go for, and then the community and what they want, right? And a lot of the time the community wants updates, they want transparency, right? And I'm usually in favor of transparency a lot of the time, right? Like, just be honest, tell us what's going on. And honestly, a lot of the time, I think that would stem the tides a little bit for a lot of the more reasonable people. But Warner Brothers, and for many of you guys who don't know, there's been rumors and chatter that Warner Brothers has taken a step back from X or Twitter, and a lot of that is down to a boycott. And we've seen that sparingly over the past little while, where, you know, the Suicide Squad Twitter was kind of quiet for a while, then they weren't, and there really isn't a lot of communication that goes out over Twitter versus their Discord. And that's a whole other conversation between what platforms do you use, what platforms do you not use. And it seems like they want to funnel as many people into their Discord as possible, because a lot of the time you have more control over your Discord, the messaging is out there, and you can kind of just give more versus kind of like the Twitter and whatnot that you have there. And that's always going to be a conversation. We had that conversation in the Avengers community, and I'm sure many other games have that conversation as well. But just in general, when we look at the communication, there hasn't really been a lot until yesterday, right? A lot of the stuff that has gone on hasn't really been talked about officially. We've had community managers in the Discord kind of interact with a lot of the people having those issues and kind of taking down information and just kind of saying like, we'll pass this on. But there really hasn't been a lot in terms of like, we've identified this, we're working on it. And honestly, I think up until yesterday when Derek was on Twitter and they kind of talked about the affliction with Burn and kind of how that's working, and Lejeune kind of asked about the mastery levels being locked, a lot of this stuff kind of flew under the radar, it seemed like, from the community's point of view, because just nothing was talked about, right? And I think it's really interesting because if I go back a couple of years with Andy and Marvel's Avengers, they seemed to kind of be very in face of the community, but there wasn't really a lot to talk about at times, right? So it's always trying to strike the middle ground balance of like, do we go out there in the community even if we have nothing to say, or do we wait until we have something to say? And I don't think there's a right answer, because so much is fluid, so much is changing. But honestly, I think when it comes to certain things with the bigger bugs, for example, like players can't log into the game, I think a proactive approach to the messaging about that probably would be better than the reactive approach, which is just kind of Warner Brothers support being like, hey, can you go upvote this on Twitter? And it's like a link to like their bugs page where people are also having this issue. I think that is kind of a weak position to take, but obviously they have their own reasons for that, and I'm just going to kind of let that go. But in terms of communication, I don't think it's been the strongest point at this point in time, 10 days into the launch of the game. But I think there is room for improvement, especially as things go on. I would like to see them be more in face of the community when things are kind of impacting the game negatively, instead of just kind of like not ducking out, but like obviously whoever is controlling the communication, whoever is kind of controlling the reins of that, kind of has to let them be out there a little bit more to kind of stem the tides of the negativity and just kind of let people know that, like, obviously it's being worked on. But a lot of the time people want that reassurance, right? It's like that very needy girlfriend or boyfriend that's thinking you're going to break up with them. But obviously they just need to hear it sometimes, where they're like, okay, they like, obviously you're not breaking up with me, but sometimes it's just good to hear it, right? So I think that would definitely help in terms of communication. So some things to improve upon, some things are okay, but definitely when it comes to the big stuff, definitely would like to see them be a more proactive and give proactive messaging for it. Okay, so the last topic of today's video, and I know there's so much that we could talk about here, but obviously the big one here for a lot of the community is going to be the end game. Now, the end game is really interesting because I like the structure of it, and obviously there's a lot to kind of take in from the structure, because I think a lot of people were expecting like a Destiny structure, right? Where you have your strikes, your dungeons, your raids, but this is actually more in line with a Diablo kind of end game, where it's just your rifts and you're running your rifts and your greater rifts, right? The whole point of a Diablo end game is to kind of do similar stuff, but just increase the difficulty and push your build all the way to the end, right? Whereas I think many people wanted a Destiny style end game or an MMO style end game where there's raids and big bosses and things you can do. And while there is obviously the Brainiac boss fight, it isn't structured in that sort of way. So I think for myself, I had to kind of reshape my brain a little bit here to kind of appreciate what we have instead of kind of what I wanted it to be, which is kind of interesting, right? Because obviously going into the game, they talked about it, but my perception of what I wanted didn't really change with that until I was actually playing it. Now, obviously, when you talk about an end game style like that, the whole point is to push your builds up until, you know, they very much so can, right? So for some people, their build might go to Mastery 50, or for some that might go to Mastery 200. Now, the problem with the end game that players have identified is that burn builds are just head and shoulders above the rest, right? And that's what they've talked about, right? What Derek put on Twitter is that burn builds are so far above the rest that it's not even worth using any other afflictions. Now, there's a few different points to be made there, right? Obviously, burn is good, but why is burn so good, right? Because it definitely works against higher level enemies in the higher mastery levels, whereas others just don't, right? And a lot of that comes down to the scaling of the health levels, right? So as you go higher in the tiers, the enemy scales higher, and obviously at a certain point in time, burn just kind of beats everything else out. Now, there's a few different ways to fix that, right? Obviously, the one that they're going to do is actually nerf burn a little bit, right? So you could use nerf, you could use fix, you know, they choose to use fix. Many people would choose to use nerf, but obviously burn is being adjusted. Now, what's that going to do? Well, it's going to bring burn in line with everything else. So at a certain point in time, every affliction is just not going to be that great, right? And we're going to see that unless they make any sort of changes to the mastery levels and the health scaling. What's going to happen is that even burn builds are going to go too high, right? And we've seen burn be used by the top players, pushing mastery level 200, for example. And I think that's going to be a very disappointing change for the community versus changing the scaling of the health. And I think that would actually make things a lot better. Now, obviously, if you only change the scaling of the health, you probably still will end up in the same position where burn will probably win out. So I think it's probably a mixture of both fixes together to kind of bring burn in line, but also change the scaling of the health for the enemies to kind of make things better for those other afflictions. Okay, and I think one of the things too is that it's not just the scaling and the afflictions, but the modifiers are a big thing as well, and how that interacts with your core game. Now, obviously, one of the modifiers in Season 0 is going to be that when enemies die, they explode, which doesn't really work well with the game itself because you have to do your melee animation for shields, and a lot of people are running into issues with that. So I think even then, the modifiers and how they impact the gameplay and which modifiers are active definitely can be detrimental is probably the best word here to a lot of the play styles, and that's probably why a lot of people are using burn right now for that invulnerability as well. So it definitely does seem that like the scaling as well as the modifiers are playing a big impact into burn builds being where they are, and I think there has to be some looks at the modifiers that they have and being like which one is going to work the longest and which one is going to work towards the playstyles that players are using. And obviously, if you're able to tweak some things about the game and put a modifier in that kind of forces players to tweak and they have multiple ways to tweak, that's good. But I think right now players feel very restricted. And obviously, when you have a certain meta build that is head and shoulders above the rest, you really have to dig deep and say, why is this impacting the game so much? And what are they doing to kind of get around this issue or this issue? And you really have to kind of hone in. I've seen a lot of people on Twitter kind of talk about how they didn't really see this in playtesting. And Derek's comment on Twitter obviously was that there's certain builds that players haven't found yet, which is really interesting because I would really like to know from the best players at Rocksteady, what took them to a mastery level 100 or 200, for example? What builds did that? Because right now, once again, it seems like if you're not running a burn build, you're not hitting a certain point. You're just kind of being capped at a certain mastery level, and that's it. So there is some things to be worked out with the end game, and obviously there's certain things to be optimistic about. I think obviously the structure of the end game is good. Climbing those mastery levels and doing all of that stuff is really fun. But obviously when it comes to what afflictions are going well, what modifiers are kind of not going so well, and how do you adjust that, right? One of the things that players have talked about is the kind of cadence of updates to kind of adjust certain things. Is that going to be every episode, or is that going to be every couple of weeks? And I think one of those things that really needs to be talked about is if something is head and shoulders above the rest and you're kind of forced to use that build to kind of progress as high as you can, will that be adjusted regularly or semi-regularly? And what can you expect there? So obviously some conversation and discussion around the end game. And that's really it, guys. Obviously, there's so much more that we could talk about, including the community perception and everything to do with that. But I really kind of wanted to focus in on some of the stuff impacting the community and the core community rather than just kind of the outside voices looking in, right? Because obviously a lot of people have put a lot of stock into kind of what's being said about the game, but I think sometimes it's all about kind of what's being talked about between the regular community and the developers, as well as what's impacting the people actually playing the game. And that's really what it comes down to. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you guys want more Suicide Squad content, as always, make sure you subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a nice little comment, and I will see you guys very, very soon. As always, enjoy the rest of your day and the night. Take care of yourselves. Later, guys.